In today's video, we will be discussing the murder of Kent Leppink, a wealthy fishing boat owner who was found dead on the Kenai Peninsula in Alaska in 1996. His murder investigation led to the discovery of a complex web of lies, seduction, and betrayal, with Michelle Hughes at the center of it all. Hughes was a young woman from New Orleans who moved to Alaska to work as a stripper, where she met Leppink and several other men who fell for her. On May 2, 1996, two Chugach electric workers inspecting the transmission grid across the Kenai Peninsula stumbled upon a crime scene. They found a man lying on the path with a chest wound, a massive hole in his face, and a line of dried blood trailing from his left ear. Several bullet casings were scattered on the ground. The workers immediately called the Alaska State Troopers. Trooper Rodney Pilch rushed to the scene and discovered the victim's wallet and checkbook protruding from his right pants pocket. The dead man was identified as Kent Leppink, 36, who lived in South Anchorage. Trooper investigator Ron Belden and Sergeant Steve DeHart arrived at the scene, and DeHart became the lead investigator on the case. The detectives determined that an Israeli-made Desert Eagle semi-automatic pistol was used to fire the .44 caliber casings scattered on the ground. The medical examiner stated that the killer first shot Leppink in the back and then shot him twice more after he fell to the ground. During the investigation, the troopers learned that Leppink's checks listed another account holder named Michelle Hughes, and the address on the checks belonged to a house owned by John Carlin in Wasilla. When the troopers arrived at the house, they found Michelle Hughes, John Carlin III, and Carlin's son, John Carlin IV, all working in a storage shed at the rear of the house. The three claimed they were looking for possessions their housemate, Kent Leppink, stole from them and hid in the shed. One of the detectives informed Michelle that Kent Leppink had been found murdered. Michelle appeared very upset by the news of Leppink's death, but the trooper did not buy her display of grief. As troopers investigated the death of Kent Leppink, they uncovered a complex web of lies, seduction, and betrayal, with Michelle Hughes at the center of it all. Michelle Hughes was a young woman from New Orleans with big dreams. At 16, she left her hometown to pursue a modeling career in New York. However, the modeling industry did not bring her the success she was hoping for, so she decided to get a college education to find a good job and marry a respectable man. To pay for her tuition, Michelle started working as a stripper at a nightclub in New Orleans. When Michelle turned 21, she moved to Alaska to work at the Great Alaskan Bush Company, where she made between $1,000 and $3,000 a night in tips. Michelle was not a great dancer, but her good looks and charming personality made men fall for her. She formed relationships with several of her fans, including Kent Leppink, John Carlin, and Scott Hilke, and accepted engagement rings from all three of them. By 1996, Michelle had earned enough money to retire from stripping and buy a house in Wasilla. Kent Leppink often stayed with her, and when Michelle mentioned the dry rot in her house to her friend John Carlin, he invited Michelle, Hilke, and Leppink to move in with him in Anchorage. Although Hilke traveled frequently for business, he accepted Carlin's offer to stay at his house when he was in town. Scott Hilke, a traveling businessman, met Michelle at the Great Alaskan Bush Company. Despite not having extra money, he often flew her to exotic resorts using frequent flyer miles. They lived together for a while, but he later moved back to California, though they continued to meet for trysts. After receiving $1.2 million in a legal settlement due to lead poisoning from a former employer, John Carlin moved his family to Alaska. Unfortunately, his wife passed away soon after their arrival. John purchased a house in Anchorage and stayed with his son. When he met Michelle at the Great Alaskan Bush Company, he fell in love with her and began spending his settlement money on her. Kent Leppink came from a wealthy family owning a grocery store chain in the Midwest. However, he was fired for embezzling $100,000 from the family business. Kent then worked as a crewman on a fishing boat in Alaska, where he fell in love with the industry and the state. With money from his father, he bought his own fishing boat. Despite his attraction to men, Kent fell in love with Michelle but refused to have sex before marriage, even knowing she was having affairs. Before his murder, He reportedly made advances towards John Carlin IV, causing his father's anger. Kent was jealous of Michelle's other suitors and spied on her, often reading her emails and stealing from his roommates. Michelle met Scott at Lake Tahoe, and to throw Kent off their trail, she left a note asking John Carlin if she could spend the weekend at his cabin. Troopers believed Kent drove to Hope to search for the cabin, but was lured into the wilderness by Michelle and Carlin, where they killed him. 3 months before Kent's murder, Michelle and Kent met with an insurance agent to purchase life insurance policies for $1 million each. Kent listed Michelle as the primary beneficiary on his policy, and he also changed his will, naming Michelle as the sole beneficiary of his property. Days before his death, Kent changed the beneficiary on his life insurance policy from Michelle to his parents, and this form was found in his pocket at the murder scene. Kent had confided to a lawyer that Michelle was cheating on him, had stolen some of his belongings, and had made large purchases on his credit card, and he believed he was going to be killed. The lawyer advised Kent to get out of the relationship, but Kent was obsessed with Michelle and could not leave her. Kent Leppink's parents in Michigan received a package from him containing a letter and a sealed envelope 2 days after his body was found. The letter instructed them to open the envelope only if they thought something suspicious had happened to him. Inside the envelope was a letter from Kent, which became known as Kent Leppink's letter from the grave. In the letter, he urged his parents to suspect Michelle Hughes, John Carlin, or Scott Hilke if he died under suspicious circumstances. Despite the helpful letter, detectives had no direct evidence against anyone and no idea why Kent believed he was about to be killed. Following Kent's death, John Carlin and his son returned to New Jersey, with Carlin having wasted most of his $1 million insurance payout on Michelle. Scott Hilke ended his casual relationship with Michelle and reconciled with his estranged wife. Michelle moved back to New Orleans, enrolled at Loyola University, and worked as a stripper at a local club on several nights a week. Michelle later met Carlin Linehan, a medical student at Tulane University, and they got married in the spring of 1998. The following year, they welcomed their daughter. Carlin served as a military physician assigned to Madigan Army Medical Center at Joint Base Lewis McChord near Tacoma, Washington, as part of the Army Reserve. The family resided in Olympia, Washington, where Michelle assumed the role of a suburban housewife. She earned her master's degree and worked as an intern at the Washington State Executive Ethics Board. Michelle was involved in her daughter's school, volunteered at a suicide crisis center, and was active in her church. After 9 years of inactivity on the Kent Leppink murder case, retired State Trooper Detective Jim Stogsdill took over as lead investigator when the file was assigned to the cold case unit in 2005. Stogsdill noticed that the troopers had only interviewed John Carlin IV, a minor at the time, in the presence of his father, and since they were now estranged, Stogsdill thought he might be willing to talk about the case. When Stogsdill and another detective met with Carlin IV in Tacoma, he revealed that his father had purchased a Desert Eagle .44 Magnum and washed the gun in bleach after the murder. The detectives seized Michelle's laptop computer and John Carlin III's desktop computer, which were never thoroughly inspected at the time of the murder. In 2006, the cold case legal team presented their evidence to the Alaska grand jury, and they indicted Michelle Hughes Linehan and John Carlin III with conspiracy and first-degree murder. Carlin flew from New Jersey to Anchorage and turned himself in at the courthouse, while Michelle was found in Olympia and brought to Anchorage. The case was circumstantial, but the prosecutors felt they had enough evidence to convince the grand jury. Michelle, who had since married and become a suburban housewife, was now facing charges for a crime committed over a decade earlier. In March of 2007, the trial of John Carlin III was underway, and it quickly became a media spectacle. The case involved the murder of Kent Leppink, a man who was engaged to Michelle Linehan, a former stripper who was now married to a doctor. Michelle had been engaged to 2 other men at the same time as Kent, and the 3 of them had even lived together for a time. The case was further complicated by the fact that Kent had taken out a $1 million life insurance policy, with Michelle as the beneficiary. The prosecution argued that Michelle had convinced Kent to take out the life insurance policy, with the understanding that she would share the payout with John Carlin III, who would then kill Kent. Michelle, however, did not know that Kent had removed her as the beneficiary and named his parents instead. The prosecution also claimed that Michelle and Carlin had taken their inspiration from the plot of the movie The Last Seduction, in which a woman persuades her lover to kill her husband for his drug money. Carlin's defense attorney, however, argued that Michelle was the one who had pulled the trigger and killed Kent, and that Carlin was just an unwitting participant. The most damaging testimony in the trial came from Carlin's own son, who claimed to have seen his father washing a gun with bleach. The defense produced witnesses who testified that the son was a compulsive liar with a violent temper and a grudge against Kent. The prosecution's case relied heavily on deleted emails that had been recovered from Michelle and Carlin's computers. These emails hinted at the tension and conflict in the Carlin household in the months leading up to Kent's murder. Some of the emails were ambiguous, and it was unclear whether they referred to the murder plot or something else entirely. Despite the defense's efforts, the jury ultimately found John Carlin III guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 99 years in prison, with the possibility of parole in 33 years. In September 2007, Michelle's trial began, and the prosecution presented a witness from the Great Alaskan Bush Company who claimed that Michelle had watched the movie The Last Seduction with her and expressed a desire to be like the woman in the film who convinces her lover to murder her husband for his drug money. Scott Hilke, who was one of Michelle's lovers, testified that The Last Seduction was one of Michelle's favorite movies, but also suggested that John Carlin's son might have been the one to kill Leppink. He said that John IV told him about the murder and how Leppink had been killed on the day that Michelle and the Carlins learned of it, even though the details of the murder had not been released to the public at that time. Michelle's sister also testified, claiming that Michelle had told her that Leppink deserved to die and should have been tortured. The jurors surprised many by returning a guilty verdict for Michelle of first-degree murder on October 22, 2007. Many observers of the trial had believed that the prosecution's case was weak. Michelle received the same sentence as John Carlin, 99 years in prison, with the judge stating that he saw no difference between the person who pulls the trigger and the person who pulls the strings. John Carlin III was not an easy inmate to deal with at Spring Creek Correctional Center. A racist, he would often start arguments with his fellow inmates, leading to a violent altercation that saw him placed in protective custody. But as soon as he returned to the general population, another inmate attacked him. Unfortunately, on October 27, 2008, one or more prisoners beat Carlin to death. Before he died, his attorney had filed an appeal to overturn his conviction. His murder occurred before the appeal was heard, forcing the court to vacate his conviction. Meanwhile, Michelle's family had hired two of Anchorage's best attorneys to handle her appeal. They argued that the judge allowed inappropriate evidence, including testimony about the movie The Last Seduction and Kent's letter from the grave. The defense could not cross-examine Kent about the letter, so it should never have been presented as evidence. The appeals court agreed with Michelle's lawyers and said that neither the testimony about the movie nor the letter from the grave should have been allowed in the trial. They overturned her conviction and threw out her indictment. Prosecutors could have tried her again, but they decided they did not have enough evidence for another indictment. Michelle was allowed to return to her life as a soccer mom in Olympia, Washington, and she now operates Tacoma Laser Clinic in Tacoma, Washington. Although it remains unclear who murdered Kent Leppink, it is clear that Michelle Hughes' web of seduction and jealousy created a toxic environment that ultimately spawned his murder. What do you think happened to Kent? Let me know in the comments. I would love to hear what you have to say. Also, consider giving this video a like if you liked it. That really helps with the algorithm. Additionally, consider subscribing to the channel for more true crime. Till next time, signing off. This has been Christina.